What if your peaceful sanctuary was suddenly under siege by your own neighbor? My name is Blake Thompson, and if you had told me 3 years ago that I'd be writing this story, I would have laughed in your face. Back then, I was just another cog in the corporate machine, a 34-year-old tech entrepreneur who lived, breathed, and probably bled Silicon Valley startup culture. 12-hour days were my norm. 14-hour days were frequent. 16-hour days? Well, those were just Tuesday. I had built my company from the ground up, starting in a cramped studio apartment with nothing but a laptop, a dream, and an unhealthy addiction to energy drinks. 5 years later, I was running a successful software development firm with 30 employees and clients across 3 continents. By all external measures, I had made it. But success, I learned, is a double-edged sword. The more successful you become, the more everyone wants a piece of you. Investors demanding quarterly reports. Employees needing guidance. Clients expecting miracles. Family members who suddenly remembered you existed now that you had money. The stress was eating me alive from the inside out. I wasn't sleeping. I wasn't eating properly. I hadn't been on a real vacation in 3 years. My last relationship had ended when Sarah told me I was married to my work, and honestly, she wasn't wrong. That's when Dr. Martinez, my physician, delivered the wake-up call I didn't know I needed. "Blake, your blood pressure is through the roof," she said, reviewing my test results during what was supposed to be a routine checkup. "Your cortisol levels are dangerously high. If you don't make some serious lifestyle changes, you're looking at a heart attack before you're 40. The words hit me like a freight train. I had been so focused on building my empire that I had forgotten to build a life worth living. That night, I sat in my downtown condo, looking out at the city lights and feeling completely empty. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had more money than I had ever dreamed of, but I felt poorer than I had in years. I was surrounded by success, but I was drowning in loneliness. I needed an escape. Not just a weekend getaway or a week-long vacation. I needed a real sanctuary, a place where I could disconnect from the digital world and reconnect with myself. That's when I started looking for a cabin. Finding the perfect retreat wasn't easy. I spent months scrolling through real estate listings, visiting properties that promised peace and privacy but delivered neither. Some were too close to civilization. Others were too remote. A few were perfect but priced like Manhattan penthouses. Then I found it. The listing was simple. Secluded lake cabin, 2 bedrooms, 1.5 acres, private lake access. The photos showed a rustic but well-maintained log cabin nestled among towering pine trees, with a pristine lake stretching out behind it like a mirror reflecting the sky. But it was the final photo that sold me, a sunset view from the back deck, with the lake painted in shades of orange and pink, and not another soul in sight. I called the realtor immediately. "Oh, the Morrison property." Jennifer, the listing agent, said enthusiastically. "It's absolutely gorgeous. The previous owner was an artist who lived there for 20 years. He only sold because he's moving to Florida to be closer to his grandchildren." "What's the catch?" I asked, because in my experience, if something seemed too good to be true, it usually was. "Well," Jennifer hesitated, "there is a homeowners association. Some people find them challenging." I laughed. "Jennifer, I've dealt with venture capitalists and Fortune 500 executives. I think I can handle a homeowners association." Famous last words. The cabin was everything the photos had promised and more. As I walked through the property during my first visit, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. The air was clean and crisp. The only sounds were birds chirping and water lapping against the shore. It was exactly what my soul needed. The interior was cozy but modern, with exposed wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered stunning views of the lake. The master bedroom had a balcony that overlooked the water, and I could already picture myself having morning coffee there, watching the sunrise paint the sky. The property came with 1.5 acres of land, most of it wooded, with about 200 feet of private lake frontage. There was a small dock, a fire pit area, and even a shed for storing kayaks and fishing equipment. "The HOA fee is $200 per quarter," Jennifer explained as we walked the property lines. "They maintain the common areas, organize community events, and handle snow removal for the main roads in winter." "Sounds reasonable," I said, already mentally decorating the place. "There are some rules, of course. No loud parties after 10 p.m., no permanent structures without approval, maintain your property in good condition. Standard stuff, really." I nodded, only half listening. I was too busy imagining myself decompressing here on weekends, maybe even working remotely a few days a week during the summer. 3 weeks later, I was the proud owner of my own slice of paradise. Moving into the cabin was like stepping into a different world. For the first month, I kept to myself, focusing on settling in and establishing new routines. I would drive up Friday evening, work remotely from the cabin on Saturdays, and spend Sundays hiking, kayaking, or simply sitting on the deck with a book. The transformation was immediate and profound. My sleep improved. My appetite returned. The constant knot of stress in my chest began to loosen. For the first time in years, I felt like myself again. The neighbors seemed pleasant enough. I met Bob and Linda from the cabin on my left during my second week. They were retired teachers who had moved there full-time after Bob's heart attack 5 years earlier. They were friendly but respected boundaries, exactly the type of neighbors I had hoped for. Then there was Karen. Karen lived in the house immediately to my right, a large modern structure that looked completely out of place among the rustic cabins that dotted the rest of the neighborhood. Where everyone else had simple wooden signs marking their properties, Karen had installed elaborate stone pillars flanked by manicured gardens that belonged in a suburban subdivision, not a lakeside retreat. I first encountered Karen on a Tuesday morning during my third week. I was on the deck, enjoying my morning coffee and watching a family of ducks paddle across the lake, when I heard someone clearing their throat aggressively. "Excuse me." I turned to find a woman in her late 40s standing at the edge of my property. She was impeccably dressed in what looked like expensive athleisure wear, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe ponytail. Everything about her posture screamed authority and disapproval. "You must be the new owner," she said, not waiting for me to confirm. "I'm Karen Wells, HOA president." "Blake Thompson," I replied, walking over to the deck railing. "Nice to meet you." "I hope it will be," she said, and something about her tone made me uncomfortable. I wanted to introduce myself and go over a few things. "Sure," I said, trying to maintain a friendly demeanor despite the warning bells going off in my head. Karen pulled out a tablet and began reading from it like she was delivering a legal document. "First, I noticed you've been parking your car on the grass near your cabin. All vehicles must be parked on approved surfaces only: gravel, concrete, or asphalt." I looked over at my car, which was indeed parked on a small patch of grass near the front door. I didn't realize that was a problem. The previous owner seemed to park there based on the tire tracks. "The previous owner was lenient about following the rules," Karen said with obvious disdain. "Things are different now. Second, I noticed you've been using the dock without registering your watercraft." "My kayak?" I asked, incredulous. "All watercraft must be registered with the HOA and display approved identification tags." I felt my blood pressure starting to rise. "It's a kayak. I bought it at Dick's Sporting Goods." "Rules are rules," Karen said, making a note on her tablet. "Third, quiet hours are strictly enforced. No outdoor activities before 8 a.m. or after 8 p.m. I was drinking coffee on my deck, I said, my voice getting tighter. "Coffee is fine. But I heard you talking on the phone yesterday morning at 7:30 a.m. Your voice carries across the water." I stared at her in disbelief. "You're policing my phone conversations?" "I'm ensuring all residents can enjoy the peaceful environment they paid for," Karen replied smoothly. "I'll email you the complete HOA guidelines. I trust you'll review them carefully." She turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and Blake? The previous owner may have been casual about enforcement, but I take my responsibilities seriously. I hope we can work together to maintain the standards this community deserves." As she walked away, I felt my peaceful morning evaporate. The knot in my chest was back and I hadn't even finished my first cup of coffee. Over the next few weeks, Karen's presence became a constant source of tension. It seemed like every time I stepped outside, she was there, watching, waiting, ready to pounce on any perceived violation of her precious rules. When I installed a small bird feeder on a tree near my deck, Karen cited me for unauthorized installation of feeding stations. When I left my kayak on the beach overnight instead of storing it in the shed, I received a formal warning about improper watercraft storage. When I had a pizza delivered on a Friday night, Karen knocked on my door to inform me that the delivery driver had parked inappropriately on the common area. Each incident was documented with photographs, timestamps, and formal written notices. Karen treated every minor infraction like a federal crime, and she had turned harassment into an art form. The worst part wasn't the constant scrutiny, it was the way she managed to make me feel like a criminal for simply existing in my own space. I found myself second-guessing every decision, every movement, every moment of relaxation. The cabin that was supposed to be my sanctuary was becoming another source of stress. I tried talking to other neighbors about the situation, hoping to find allies or at least understanding. Bob and Linda were sympathetic but cautious. Karen's been president for 3 years, Bob explained during a chance encounter at the mailboxes. She's intense. But she has supporters on the board. What about the rest of the neighborhood? I asked. Linda glanced around nervously. Most people just try to stay out of her way. She's got a long memory and a short temper. I met a few other residents during my walks around the community. There was Dave, a retired construction worker who had been dealing with Karen's complaints about his non-conforming work truck for 2 years. There was Maria, a nurse who worked night shifts and had been cited multiple times for excessive noise when she came home at 3 a.m. There was even Jim, an elderly veteran who had been fined for displaying an American flag that was too large, according to Karen's interpretation of the guidelines. The pattern was clear. Karen had systematically bullied and harassed anyone who didn't conform to her vision of the perfect community. She used the HOA rules as weapons, interpreting them in whatever way served her purposes. But I also sensed an undercurrent of resentment. People were tired of walking on eggshells. They were frustrated with the constant surveillance and petty enforcement. They just didn't know how to fight back. I began to wonder, what would happen if someone actually stood up to Karen? What would happen if someone refused to be intimidated? I was about to find out. The situation reached a crescendo in early September. I had been looking forward to this particular weekend for weeks, my first real gathering at the cabin. I had invited 3 close friends from my college days. Marcus, a fellow entrepreneur, Sarah, different Sarah from my ex, a marketing executive, and Jake, a software engineer who had been one of my first employees. These weren't just friends, they were my chosen family. We had supported each other through career changes, relationship disasters, and personal crises. They had been there for me during the darkest days of building my company, and I wanted to share this new chapter of my life with them. I had planned everything carefully. I researched the HOA guidelines thoroughly, making sure every aspect of the gathering would comply with the rules. I would limit the group to 3 guests. All activities would end by 8 p.m. I would provide designated parking areas on my property. I even sent a courtesy email to Karen, informing her of the gathering and providing contact information for all attendees. My friends arrived Friday evening, and the reunion was everything I had hoped for. We spent the evening catching up, sharing stories, and marveling at the beauty of the lake. Marcus brought his guitar and we sat around the fire pit, singing old songs and laughing until our sides hurt. Saturday morning dawned perfect, clear skies, gentle breeze, temperature in the low 70s. We spent the morning kayaking and swimming, then fired up the grill for a lakeside barbecue. It was the most relaxed I had felt in months. That's when everything went wrong. I was in the middle of flipping burgers when Karen appeared at the edge of my property, her face twisted with rage. "Blake Thompson," she shouted, marching across my lawn like she owned the place. "This is completely unacceptable." My friend stopped talking and turned to stare. I could feel my face flushing with embarrassment and anger. "What's the problem, Karen?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. "The problem is that you have unauthorized guests using community resources." "These are my friends and we're on my property," I replied, gesturing to the clearly marked property lines. "Your guests parked in the common area," Karen shrieked, pointing toward the road. I looked where she was pointing. 2 of my friends' cars were parked along the gravel shoulder near the entrance to my property, the same place I had seen dozens of other residents park when they had guests. "That's not the common area," I said. "That's the road shoulder. It's community property, and your guests are trespassing." "Karen, you're being ridiculous," I said, my patience finally snapping. "My friends are parked legally, they're on my property, and they're not bothering anyone." "They're bothering me," Karen screamed. "And I'm the president of this HOA. Being president doesn't give you the right to harass people," I shot back. Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red. "How dare you? I am trying to maintain the standards of this community." "No, you're trying to control people," I said, my voice rising. "You're a bully who uses the HOA as an excuse to make everyone else's life miserable." "That's it," Karen shouted. "You're in violation of multiple HOA guidelines, and I'm reporting this to the authorities." "Go ahead," I said, my anger overriding my judgment. "Call whoever you want. My friends are welcome here and they're not going anywhere." Karen stood there for a moment, apparently shocked that someone had finally stood up to her. Then she turned and stormed off, pulling out her phone as she walked. My friends looked at me with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Dude," Jake said quietly, "I think you just declared war on the neighborhood, Karen." "Maybe it's about time someone did," I replied, but even as I said it, I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. 30 minutes later, I heard the sound of gravel crunching in my driveway. I looked up from the grill to see two sheriff's department vehicles pulling up to my cabin. My heart sank. Karen had actually called the cops. Two officers got out of the first car, a middle-aged man with sergeant stripes and a younger woman who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. From the second car emerged a park ranger, which confused me until I remembered that our lake was technically part of the state park system. "Blake Thompson?" the sergeant asked as he approached. "That's me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm Sergeant Rodriguez, this is Officer Martinez, and this is Ranger Williams. We received a complaint about trespassing and disturbing the peace." "I'm not sure what complaint you're referring to," I said. "My friends and I are having a barbecue on my property. The complaint alleges that you have unauthorized guests using community resources and that you became belligerent when asked to comply with HOA regulations." I felt my friends moving closer, forming a protective circle around me. Marcus, who had dealt with his share of legal issues during his own entrepreneurial journey, stepped forward. "Officers, I'm Marcus Chen, one of Blake's guests. We're all here voluntarily, we're on private property, and we haven't broken any laws." Sergeant Rodriguez looked around the property, taking in the scene. "Who made the complaint?" "Karen Wells," I said. "She's the HOA president and my neighbor." "Where is Mrs. Wells now?" the sergeant asked. "I assume she's at her house," I said, pointing toward Karen's property. "Officer Martinez, would you mind asking Mrs. Wells to join us? I'd like to hear her side of the story." As Officer Martinez walked toward Karen's house, I felt a mixture of dread and anticipation. Part of me wanted to avoid any further escalation, but another part of me was ready to have this confrontation once and for all. Karen emerged from her house a few minutes later, accompanied by Officer Martinez. She had changed into a more formal outfit and was carrying a thick folder that I assumed contained documentation of all my alleged violations. "Officers, thank you for responding so quickly," Karen said, her tone now sugary sweet. "I've been having ongoing issues with Mr. Thompson's failure to follow community guidelines." "What specific laws are being broken here?" Sergeant Rodriguez asked. Karen opened her folder and began reading from what looked like a prepared statement. "Mr. Thompson has repeatedly violated parking regulations, noise ordinances, and guest policies. Today, his unauthorized guests are trespassing on community property and disturbing the peace." "Ma'am, I need to clarify something," Sergeant Rodriguez said. "Are you reporting violations of community association rules, or are you reporting violations of state and local laws?" Karen hesitated. "Well, both." "Let's focus on the laws first," the sergeant said. "What laws are being broken?" Karen's confidence seemed to waver. "The trespassing," she said weakly. "Where is the trespassing occurring?" Ranger Williams asked. "The guests are parked in the common area without permission." Sergeant Rodriguez walked over to examine the parked cars. "These vehicles are parked on the road shoulder, which is legal as long as they're not blocking traffic or creating a hazard." "But it's community property," Karen protested. "Actually, ma'am, the road and shoulders are county property," Ranger Williams said. "The community doesn't have authority over parking on county roads." I watched Karen's face as the reality of her situation began to sink in. She had called the police to report violations that weren't actually violations. "What about the noise?" Karen asked desperately. "What noise?" Officer Martinez asked. "We can hear normal conversation and some music, but it's the middle of the afternoon and well within acceptable levels." "But the HOA quiet hours?" "Ma'am," Sergeant Rodriguez interrupted, "HOA rules are civil matters. We only enforce actual laws." Karen stood there, clutching her folder, her face cycling through various shades of red and purple. The officers were clearly losing patience with her. "Is there anything else?" Sergeant Rodriguez asked. They're being disruptive," Karen said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I don't see any evidence of disruptive behavior," the sergeant replied. "Mr. Thompson, we apologize for the inconvenience. Enjoy your barbecue." As the officers began walking back to their vehicles, I felt a surge of vindication. Karen's attempt to use the police as her personal enforcers had backfired spectacularly. But Karen wasn't done yet. "Wait," she called out. "What about the property damage?" Everyone stopped and turned around. "What property damage?" Sergeant Rodriguez asked. "They've been using the lake without permission," Karen said. "That's community property." Ranger Williams stepped forward. "Ma'am, this is a public lake. No one needs permission to use it." "But the dock access." "The dock is on Mr. Thompson's property," the ranger said, consulting his tablet. According to our records, his property line extends to the high water mark. I saw Karen's face go pale. That can't be right. Would you like to see the property survey? I asked, pulling out my phone. I have the digital copy right here. As I showed the property boundaries to the officers, Karen's expression shifted from anger to confusion to something approaching panic. Officers, I think there might be some confusion about the property lines, Ranger Williams said diplomatically. Mrs. Wells, are you certain about the boundaries of your property? Karen didn't answer. She was staring at my phone screen, her face growing paler by the second. Ma'am? Sergeant Rodriguez prompted. I need to check something, Karen said, her voice barely above a whisper. Check what? I asked, but Karen was already hurrying back toward her house. The officers exchanged glances. Mr. Thompson, do you have any ongoing disputes with your neighbor about property lines? Not that I'm aware of, I said, but even as I said it, I felt like I was missing something important. Well, if anything else comes up, you know how to reach us, Sergeant Rodriguez said. Have a good day. As the officers drove away, my friends and I stood in silence, trying to process what had just happened. That was weird, Sarah said finally. Did you see how she reacted when they mentioned the property lines? Yeah, Marcus agreed. It was like she suddenly realized something. I looked toward Karen's house, but she was nowhere to be seen. A strange feeling was building in my chest. Not quite victory, but not quite relief either. Something was definitely wrong, and I had a feeling we were about to find out what. The rest of Saturday passed without incident. Karen didn't emerge from her house, and we enjoyed a peaceful evening around the fire pit. My friends left Sunday morning, and I spent the day kayaking and reflecting on the events of the weekend. I kept thinking about Karen's reaction when the ranger mentioned the property lines. There had been something in her expression. Not just anger or embarrassment, but genuine shock. Like she had discovered something she hadn't expected. Monday morning, I was back in my city office, but I couldn't concentrate on work. I kept thinking about the confrontation, about Karen's strange behavior, about the way she had fled when the officers asked about property boundaries. Finally, I decided to do some investigating of my own. I called Jennifer, my real estate agent, and asked her to send me all the property documents again. Not just the summary I had reviewed during the purchase, but everything. Deeds, surveys, HOA documents, the works. The files arrived in my inbox Tuesday afternoon. I spent the next hour poring over them, cross-referencing property lines, easements, and community agreements. That's when I found it. According to the original community development plan, Karen's property was supposed to include a 50-foot easement for lake access. However, the actual surveyed property lines showed that this easement was never established. Instead, the 50-foot strip of land that Karen had been treating as her private lake access actually belonged to my property. I stared at the documents, reading and rereading the descriptions. There was no ambiguity. The land that Karen had been using for her dock, her beach area, and her frequent lakeside gatherings was legally mine. I called Jennifer immediately. Jennifer, I need you to look at something, I said, forwarding her the documents. Am I reading this correctly? Jennifer was quiet for several minutes as she reviewed the files. Oh my, she said finally. Blake, this is a significant issue. So I'm right? That strip of land belongs to me? According to these documents, yes. It looks like there was an error in the original development. The easement was planned but never legally established. Does Karen know? I have no idea. But if she's been using that land for years, thinking it was hers or community property, this is going to come as quite a shock. I felt a mixture of excitement and dread. On one hand, I had just discovered that my property was significantly larger than I had realized. On the other hand, I was about to deliver news that would likely send Karen into a complete meltdown. What should I do? I asked. You need to have the property professionally surveyed, Jennifer said. Once you have official confirmation, you'll need to decide how to handle the situation. What are my options? Legally, you have every right to reclaim your property. But given the circumstances, you might want to consider how to approach this diplomatically. Diplomatically. That was a nice way of saying, try not to start a war with your neighbor. But as I thought about Karen's behavior over the past few months, the constant harassment, the petty citations, the attempt to have me arrested, I realized that diplomacy might not be the most satisfying approach. It was time for Karen to learn that actions have consequences. I hired a professional surveyor to come out the following weekend. Steve Morrison was a gruff, no-nonsense man in his 60s who had been surveying properties in the area for 30 years. This is an interesting situation, Steve said as he reviewed the property documents. Looks like whoever did the original development made some assumptions that weren't reflected in the legal descriptions. How common is this kind of error? I asked. More common than you'd think. Developers sometimes create marketing materials that don't match the actual legal documents. Usually it gets sorted out during the first few property sales, but in this case, it slipped through the cracks? Exactly. Your neighbor has probably been using this land for years, assuming it was either hers or community property. Steve spent the better part of Saturday morning setting up his equipment and taking measurements. I watched from my deck, sipping coffee and enjoying the beautiful morning. Karen emerged from her house around 10 a.m., clearly agitated by the presence of the surveyor. She marched over to the property line, stopping just short of actually entering my land. "What's going on here?" she demanded. "I'm having my property surveyed," I replied calmly. "Why?" "Because I want to know exactly where my property lines are." Karen's face went pale. "The property lines are clearly marked." "Are they?" I asked. "Because according to my documents, they might not be where you think they are." Karen stood there for a moment, apparently processing this information. Then she hurried back to her house. 30 minutes later, she returned with her own folder of documents. She approached Steve, who was setting up a measuring device near the water's edge. "Excuse me," Karen said, her voice tight with barely controlled anxiety. "I need to verify something with you." Steve looked up from his equipment. "Ma'am, I'm working for Mr. Thompson. If you have questions about your property, you'll need to hire your own surveyor." "But I just need to confirm where the property line is," Karen insisted. "I can't discuss my findings with you," Steve said firmly. "That would be inappropriate." Karen's face flushed. "This is ridiculous. I've been living here for 5 years." "Ma'am, I'm just measuring what's on the legal documents," Steve said. "If you have concerns about your property boundaries, I suggest you contact a surveyor." Karen stomped back to her house, but I could see her watching from her windows as Steve continued his work. By noon, Steve had completed his measurements. He spent another hour creating a detailed map of the property boundaries, then sat down with me to review his findings. "Well, Blake, this is definitely going to shake things up," he said, spreading the survey map on my kitchen table. The map clearly showed that my property extended 50 feet further toward the lake than I had originally thought. The strip of land included Karen's dock, her beach area, and about half of what I had assumed was community lakefront. "Are you certain about this?" I asked. "Absolutely. I've triple-checked the measurements against the legal descriptions. This land belongs to you." "What about the HOA documents? Don't they show this as community property?" Steve shook his head. "The HOA documents reference the easement, but the easement was never legally established. The community has no legal claim to this land." I stared at the map, trying to process the implications. "So Karen's been trespassing on my property for 5 years? "Technically, yes. Though she probably didn't know it." "What happens now?" "That's up to you. You can allow the current use to continue, you can negotiate some kind of agreement, or you can reclaim your property." As Steve packed up his equipment, I sat on my deck, looking out at the disputed land. Karen's expensive dock. Her carefully maintained beach area. The fire pit where she had hosted numerous gatherings. All of it was on my property. All of it was mine. The irony was delicious. Karen, who had spent months harassing me about property boundaries and community standards, had been violating my property rights the entire time. I thought about her reaction when the officers had mentioned property lines. She must have had some suspicion, some nagging doubt about her claim to the land. Now she was about to find out the truth, and I was going to make sure she found out in the most dramatic way possible. I spent Sunday planning my approach. I could have handled this diplomatically, perhaps sending Karen a letter explaining the situation and offering to work out some kind of arrangement. But after months of harassment, petty citations, and her attempt to have me arrested, I felt like she deserved a taste of her own medicine. I decided to wait until the following weekend when I would be back at the cabin. I wanted to deliver this news in person, and I wanted to savor every moment of her reaction. Wednesday evening, I got a call from Jennifer. "Blake, I just heard something interesting," she said. "Karen Wells called our office today asking about property records." "What kind of questions?" "She wanted to know if there were any errors in the original development survey. She seemed very concerned about easements and property boundaries." I smiled. "She's starting to figure it out. Be careful, Blake. If she's already suspicious, she might be preparing for a fight." "Let her prepare," I said. "I have the law on my side." Friday afternoon, I arrived at the cabin to find Karen's property buzzing with activity. There were two men in hard hats examining her dock, and a woman in a business suit taking photographs of the lakefront area. Karen had hired her own surveyor. I watched from my deck as Karen's team spent the afternoon measuring and documenting. Karen herself was hovering nearby, clearly agitated and asking frequent questions. By early evening, the surveyor's team had packed up and left. Karen stood alone on her dock, staring out at the lake with her shoulders slumped in defeat. She knew. Saturday morning, I decided it was time to make my move. I put on my most professional outfit, khakis and a button-down shirt, and walked over to Karen's house with a folder containing copies of all the relevant documents. Karen answered the door looking like she hadn't slept in days. Her usually perfect appearance was disheveled, and her eyes were red-rimmed. "Blake," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I suppose you're here to gloat." "I'm here to discuss a property matter," I said formally. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. Karen's house was exactly what I had expected, perfectly decorated, sterile, and showcase-ready. She led me to a sitting room overlooking the lake, where she had spread out her own collection of property documents. "I hired a surveyor," she said without preamble. "I know. I saw them yesterday." "You were right. The easement was never established." Her voice was flat, defeated. "I know that too." Karen looked up at me, and for the first time since I had known her, she looked vulnerable. "What do you want?" "I want to discuss the fact that you've been trespassing on my property for 5 years." "I didn't know," Karen said quickly. "I bought this house believing I had lake access. The previous owner never mentioned any boundary disputes." "There were no boundary disputes," I said, "because no one knew about the error until now." "So what happens now?" Karen asked. I opened my folder and removed a copy of the survey. "This is my property," I said, pointing to the disputed area. "Your dock, your beach, your fire pit, all of it is on my land." Karen stared at the survey, her face growing paler. "You're going to make me remove everything?" "I'm going to exercise my property rights," I said. "The same way you insisted I follow HOA guidelines." "Blake, please," Karen said, and I could hear desperation creeping into her voice. "I know I've been difficult, but I invested thousands of dollars in that dock. And the beach area?" "You invested thousands of dollars in improvements to my property without my permission," I said. "That's not my problem." Karen's composure finally cracked. "This is insane. I've been the HOA president for 3 years. I've maintained community standards. I've protected property values. By harassing your neighbors and calling the police on people having barbecues? I was doing my job." "No, Karen. You were bullying people. And now you're getting a taste of what it feels like to be on the other side." Karen stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to understand what it's like to have someone else control your life," I said. "I want you to feel the same anxiety and frustration that you've put me and other neighbors through." "Fine," Karen said, turning back to me. "I apologize for being strict about the rules. Can we work something out?" "Maybe," I said. "But first, I want to see some changes in your behavior." "What kind of changes?" "I want you to resign as HOA president. I want you to issue formal apologies to every neighbor you've harassed. And I want you to reimburse people for the fines you've illegally collected." Karen's face went white. "You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious. And until I see those changes, your dock and beach area are off limits." I stood up and walked toward the door. "You have 1 week to decide, Karen. Make the right choice." As I left Karen's house, I felt a surge of satisfaction. For the first time in months, I was the one in control. Karen would have to choose between her pride and her lakefront access. Either way, she was finally going to learn that actions have consequences. The week that followed was the most peaceful I had experienced since moving to the cabin. Karen's property was eerily quiet. No dock parties, no loud phone calls, no aggressive maintenance activities. It was as if she had gone into hibernation. I spent the time researching HOA law and talking to other residents about their experiences with Karen. What I discovered was even worse than I had imagined. Dave, the retired construction worker, had been fined $500 for parking his work truck in his own driveway. When he refused to pay, Karen had placed a lien on his property. Maria, the night shift nurse, had been cited 17 times for noise violations, most of them for the sound of her car door closing when she came home from work. Jim, the elderly veteran, had been forced to take down his American flag and replace it with a smaller version that met Karen's arbitrary size requirements. The pattern was clear and disturbing. Karen had been using the HOA as her personal fiefdom, extracting money from neighbors and making their lives miserable for her own satisfaction. By Thursday, I had documented nearly $3,000 in questionable fines that Karen had collected over the past 2 years. I also discovered that she had been using HOA funds to pay for improvements to her own property, improvements that, ironically, were now on my land. Friday evening, I received an unexpected visitor. Karen appeared at my door looking haggard and defeated. "Blake, I need to talk to you," she said. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. Karen sat heavily in my living room chair, looking like she had aged 10 years in a week. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began. "About resigning from the HOA. And I can't do it. This community needs leadership, and I'm the only one with the experience and dedication to." "Karen, stop," I interrupted. "You're not a leader. You're a bully. And bullies don't get to negotiate from a position of strength." "But my dock," Karen said, her voice breaking. "My beach area. I've spent so much money." "On my property," I reminded her. "I know, but surely we can work something out. Maybe I could pay you rent, or we could establish some kind of easement." "Karen, you still don't get it," I said. "This isn't about money. This is about justice." "What do you mean?" "For months you've made my life hell. You've harassed me, cited me for imaginary violations, and even tried to have me arrested. You've done the same thing to other neighbors. And now you want mercy?" Karen's face crumpled. "I was just trying to maintain standards." "No, you were trying to control people. And now you're going to learn what it's like to be controlled." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that on Monday morning, I'm calling the sheriff's department to report the trespassing. I'm also calling the county to report the unpermitted dock installation. And I'm calling the HOA board to report the financial irregularities I've discovered." Karen went pale. "You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious. Unless..." "Unless what?" "Unless you do exactly what I told you to do. Resign from the HOA. Issue formal apologies. Reimburse the fines. And remove all your improvements from my property." Karen stared at me in shock. "You're destroying me. I'm giving you a choice. The same choice you've given other people. Comply with the rules or face the consequences." Karen sat in silence for several minutes, her face cycling through various emotions. Finally she spoke. "If I do what you're asking, will you let me keep the dock?" "No." "The beach area?" "No." "What about some kind of shared access?" "Karen, you're not listening. Everything you've built on my property has to go. That's non-negotiable. But I'll lose my lake access entirely. That's unfortunate. But it's not my problem." Karen started crying then, not the angry tears of someone who's been caught, but the desperate tears of someone who's finally realized the full scope of their situation. "Blake, please," she sobbed. "I know I've been difficult, but I love this lake. It's why I moved here. It's why I bought this house." "Then you should have been more careful about property boundaries," I said, not unkindly but firmly. "What if I make a public apology? What if I pay everyone back double?" "That's a start. But the dock still has to go." Karen looked up at me through her tears. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" "I'm not enjoying your pain, Karen. But I am enjoying the justice of it." "Justice?" "You spent months using your position to make other people miserable. Now you get to experience what that feels like." Karen wiped her eyes and stood up. "I need time to think." "You have until Monday," I said. "After that, I make the calls." As Karen walked to the door, she turned back to me. "I always thought I was protecting the community." "Maybe you even believe that," I said. "But what you were really doing was protecting your own sense of control." After Karen left, I sat on my deck, watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of orange and pink. Tomorrow I would host another gathering of friends. But this time, I wouldn't have to worry about Karen's interference. This time, I would be the one in control. Saturday morning brought an unexpected twist. I was having coffee on my deck when I noticed unusual activity at Karen's property. There were several cars parked in her driveway, and I could see people moving around her backyard. At first, I thought she might be hosting her own gathering, perhaps a final party before losing her lake access. But as I watched more carefully, I realized something else was happening. The people at Karen's house weren't guests. They were wearing work clothes and carrying tools. And they were dismantling her dock. I grabbed my binoculars and watched in amazement as Karen supervised the removal of her expensive lakefront improvements. The dock, the beach furniture, the fire pit, all of it was being carefully taken apart and loaded onto trucks. My phone rang. It was Karen. "Blake, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice strangely calm. "I can see you're busy," I said. Spring cleaning? Can you come over? There's something I need to show you. Curious, I walked over to Karen's property. The work crew was nearly finished dismantling the dock, and Karen was standing on her actual property line, well back from the lake. I hired them last night, Karen said when I approached. Emergency removal service. Why? Because I found something. Something that changes everything. Karen led me to her house, where she had spread out a collection of documents on her dining room table. These weren't the same property records I had seen before. These were older, more detailed, and they told a very different story. I spent all night going through my original purchase documents, Karen said. I called my real estate agent, my attorney, even the previous owner. And I discovered something interesting. What? I was lied to. Karen pointed to a document from her original purchase. This is the property disclosure I received when I bought the house. See this section about lake access. I read the highlighted text. Property includes exclusive use of adjoining lakefront area and dock facilities. The seller told me this was part of my property, Karen continued. He said the easement was established and that I would have permanent lake access. But the easement was never legally established, I said. Exactly. Which means I was defrauded. The seller knew there was no easement, but he represented the property as having lake access anyway. I stared at the documents trying to process this information. You're saying you were a victim too? I'm saying I paid $100,000 more for this house because I believed it came with lake access. And I've spent the past 5 years thinking I was protecting that access. That doesn't excuse your behavior toward other neighbors. You're right, Karen said, surprising me. And I'm not making excuses. But I want you to understand why I was so protective of the HOA rules. Because you thought you had something to lose? Because I thought I had something to protect. I believed that maintaining strict community standards would protect all our property values, including my supposed lake access. Karen walked to her window and looked out at the lake. I was wrong about a lot of things, Blake. But I was especially wrong about you. What do you mean? I thought you were another entitled city person who wanted to come here and ignore the rules. But you were just trying to enjoy your property in peace. Karen. Let me finish, she said, turning back to me. I've been thinking about what you said. About me being a bully. About using my position to control people. And? You were right. I became so focused on maintaining control that I forgot why I moved here in the first place. I forgot that this was supposed to be a peaceful community where people could escape from the stresses of daily life. Karen sat down at her dining room table, looking exhausted. I'm resigning from the HOA board. When? I already sent the letter. It's effective immediately. I felt a surge of satisfaction, but also something else. Something that might have been respect. What about the apologies? The refunds? I'm drafting personal letters to everyone I've mistreated. And I'm writing refund checks for all the questionable fines. And the dock. Gone. Along with everything else on your property. I looked out the window at the work crew loading the last pieces of dock onto their truck. What will you do for lake access? I don't know. Maybe I'll sell the house and find something else. Maybe I'll just accept that I made a mistake and move on. Karen, can I ask you something? Sure. Why are you being so cooperative? Yesterday you were fighting this. Today you're accepting it completely. Karen was quiet for a long moment. Because I realized something last night while I was going through these documents. What? I realized that I've been living a lie for 5 years. Not just about the property lines, but about who I was and what I was doing. I convinced myself that I was protecting the community, but I was really just protecting my own illusions. And now I want to start telling the truth. Beginning with the truth about myself. Karen stood up and walked to her front door. Blake, I owe you an apology. Not just for the property situation, but for everything. For making your life difficult, for calling the police on you, for being the kind of neighbor that nobody wants. Karen. I'm sorry. I'm genuinely deeply sorry. And I'm grateful that you forced me to confront the truth, even though it was painful. I didn't know what to say. This was not the Karen I had been dealing with for months. This was someone who seemed genuinely remorseful and self-aware. What happens now? I asked. Now I figure out how to be a better person. And you get to enjoy your lake cabin without having to worry about the neighborhood Karen. As I walked back to my property, I felt a strange mixture of emotions. Victory, certainly. Justice, absolutely. But also something unexpected, a little bit of sympathy for Karen. She had been a victim of fraud, and that had twisted her into someone she probably never intended to become. That didn't excuse her behavior, but it did explain it. And maybe, just maybe, it gave both of us a chance to start over. 3 weeks later, I hosted my second gathering at the cabin. This time, I invited not just my close friends, but several neighbors who had been dealing with Karen's harassment. Dave brought his work truck and parked it right in his own driveway, a small act of rebellion that felt like a major victory. Maria arrived in uniform after her night shift, no longer worried about noise violations for simply coming home from work. Jim brought a regulation-sized American flag and proudly displayed it on his dock. The atmosphere was festive and relaxed in a way that would have been impossible just a month earlier. People were laughing, sharing stories, and enjoying the simple pleasure of being in a community without fear. "I still can't believe she just gave up," Dave said as we sat around my fire pit. "After all these years of fighting, she just surrendered." "She didn't surrender," I said. "She realized she was wrong." "Same thing," Maria said. "Either way, we're free." "Are we though?" Jim asked. "I mean, she's still our neighbor. What happens when she decides she wants to start enforcing rules again?" "She won't," I said with confidence. "Karen's done being the HOA police." "How can you be sure?" "Because I've been talking to her." Everyone turned to stare at me. "You've been talking to Karen?" Dave asked incredulously. "She's been helping me understand the HOA's financial situation. Turns out, she kept very detailed records of everything. And she's been working to fix the problems she created. She's already refunded over $2,000 in questionable fines, and she's helping to revise the HOA guidelines to be more reasonable." "I don't buy it," Maria said. "People like Karen don't change." "Maybe not," I said. "But I think Karen was never really like Karen, if that makes sense." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I think she became a bully because she was scared and felt powerless. Now that she's dealt with the source of her fear, she's becoming someone different." "Or she's just planning her revenge," Dave said skeptically. "Maybe. But I don't think so." As if summoned by our conversation, Karen appeared at the edge of my property. She was carrying a plate of cookies and looking nervous. "I don't want to interrupt," she said. "I just wanted to bring these over." "Come join us," I said, surprising everyone, including myself. Karen approached hesitantly, as if she expected someone to tell her to leave. "I made chocolate chip cookies. They're an apology." "For what this time?" Dave asked, not unkindly but not warmly either. "For everything. For making all of you feel unwelcome in your own homes. For being the kind of neighbor that nobody wants." Karen set the plate down on a nearby table. "I know you probably don't want me here, and I understand that. But I wanted you to know that I'm selling the house." "When?" Maria asked. "I listed it yesterday. I've already had 2 showings." "Why?" I asked. "Because I realize now that I bought this house for the wrong reasons. I thought I was buying lake access, but what I was really buying was the illusion of control. And now that I've lost that illusion, I need to find a place where I can be the person I want to be, not the person I became." Karen looked around the group, making eye contact with each person. "I want all of you to know that I'm genuinely sorry. I let my fears and insecurities turn me into someone I'm not proud of. I made your lives harder when I should have been making them better." "Karen," Jim said gently, "we appreciate the apology. But actions matter more than words." "You're right," Karen said. "And I hope my actions over the past few weeks have shown you that I'm serious about making amends." "They have," I said. "Karen's been working hard to fix the problems she created." "What will you do after you sell?" Dave asked. "I'm moving to a smaller place in town. No HOA, no community rules to enforce. Just me in my own little space." "That sounds lonely," Maria said. "Maybe. But I think I need to learn how to be alone with myself before I can be a good neighbor to anyone else." Karen started to leave, then turned back. "Blake, thank you." "For what?" "For forcing me to confront the truth. I know it wasn't pleasant, but it was necessary." "What truth?" "That I had become the kind of person I used to complain about. That I was using my position to make other people miserable because I was miserable. That I had forgotten why I moved here in the first place." Karen picked up her empty plate. "Enjoy your gathering. And Blake, I'm glad you found your sanctuary. You deserve it." As Karen walked back to her house, the group sat in contemplative silence. "Well," Dave said finally, "that was unexpected." "Do you think she means it?" Maria asked. "I think she does," I said. "But even if she doesn't, she's leaving. So either way we win." "No," Jim said thoughtfully. "If she means it, we all win. Including her." We spent the rest of the evening sharing stories, making plans for future gatherings, and enjoying the simple pleasure of being in a community where people actually liked each other. As my guests prepared to leave, Dave pulled me aside. "Blake, I want to thank you for standing up to Karen. The rest of us were too beaten down to fight back." "I just got tired of being pushed around," I said. "It was more than that. You showed us that we didn't have to accept being treated badly just because someone had a title or position. Anyone would have done the same thing." "No, they wouldn't. Most people would have just kept their heads down and tried to avoid conflict. You chose to fight back, and that made all the difference." After everyone left, I sat alone on my deck watching the moon reflect on the lake. The cabin that had been purchased as a sanctuary had become something even more valuable. A place where I had learned to stand up for myself and help others do the same. Karen's house was dark and quiet. In a few weeks she would be gone and someone new would move in. I hoped they would be the kind of neighbor who understood that a true community is built on mutual respect, not arbitrary rules and petty enforcement. But if they weren't, well, I had learned that sometimes the best way to deal with a bully is to stand your ground and fight back. And I was ready to do that again if necessary. The lake was peaceful, the air was clean, and for the first time in months, I felt truly at home. My sanctuary was complete.